Have you ever had that feeling like something you've always just kind of taken for granted as true might actually be worth a second look? Like maybe there's a crack in the foundation.
Ooh.
You know, in one of those long-held beliefs. Well, that's kind of the terrain we're going to be exploring today.
Yeah, we're going to be going on a deep dive into Friedrich Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols.
Ooh, and for this particular deep dive, you've brought excerpts from the book itself, the introduction to the book, and even some translator's notes.
Yeah.
So for our listener, always hungry for knowledge and new perspectives, but doesn't want to feel like they're getting bogged down in academic jargon, our mission today is to unpack some of Nietzsche's core arguments and really get a sense of what they might mean for how you see things, how you live your life.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Nietzsche initially had a much less forceful title in mind. Yeah, he was thinking of calling it a psychologist's idleness.
A psychologist's idleness. It sounds almost like a cozy Sunday afternoon read. So what sparked the dramatic shift to Twilight of the Idols?
Well, so the original German title is Götzenhammer, which means Hammer of the Idols.
Right.
And a friend of his, Heinrich Koselitz, suggested that perhaps this title was not impactful enough.
Right.
So he went back to the drawing board and came up with Twilight of the Idols, which is a title rich with meaning. I think, first off, the hammer shouldn't be taken literally, so to speak. Nietzsche actually described it as functioning more like a tuning fork for idols.
A tuning fork?
Yes.
So instead of smashing these fundamental beliefs, it's more about testing them, striking them, and listening to the sound they make to see if they ring true.
You strike a hollow object with a tuning fork, you get a very particular kind of resonance.
Yeah.
And he wanted to use this work to test whether these idols, these very deep-seated
beliefs and assumptions, produce a solid, truthful sound when struck by the tuning fork of his critique, but also to allow his own questioning to ring out clearly.
I like that. That's a really vivid way to think about it. And in the introduction to the book, a connection is drawn to Francis Bacon and his critique of the idols of the mind.
That's right.
So this notion of questioning fundamental flaws in our thinking, this is an idea that has some historical roots.
It certainly does, yeah.
Okay, so we have Twilight of the Idols.
Yes.
Götterdämmerung.
Götterdämmerung.
In German. So how does that play into this?
So Götterdämmerung, Hammer of the Idols, or Twilight of the Idols, very strongly echoes Richard Wagner's opera, Götterdämmerung, The Twilight of the Gods, from the Ring Cycle.
Right.
And this opera really charts the downfall of the gods because they couldn't reconcile their own laws with justice.
Interesting.
So this twilight, if you will, Nietzsche is suggesting a similar fate.
Right. For the idols that he is targeting.
A period of fading light for these old beliefs, leaving us in this in-between space of certainty and uncertainty.
Precisely. Dämmerung, like our twilight, is ambiguous.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you if it's dusk or dawn.
Right.
It's just this transitional phase.
Right.
And I think that's really key to what Nietzsche is saying with this book. He wants to make it impossible to carry on holding these beliefs, these unchallenged beliefs, as if nothing had happened, as if his critique hadn't occurred.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this wasn't meant to be a standalone piece, right? This was part of a larger...
He saw it as both an accessible introduction to some of his later, more complex ideas, but also as a really concise summary of his critical thinking over the preceding 8 years.
Okay.
In fact, in his autobiography, he refers to it as the work of a nunciatory angel, a messenger heralding the arrival of what was to come.
Okay, so we've got a book with a very dramatic title.
Yes.
Intended to be a call to action to question our most basic beliefs.
Yes.
Using a hammer as a tuning fork.
Right.
So let's dive into this first key area that you've pulled out, which is Nietzsche's distrust of systematization and the problem of Socrates.
Yes.
Right away, it sounds like he's swimming against the current of traditional philosophy.
Absolutely. I think one of the most striking things about Nietzsche is that in the epigrams and arrows section of the book, he voices this really profound skepticism of any kind of rigid, all-encompassing system of thought.
Okay.
And he actually argues that this desire to have everything neatly ordered, logically consistent, is at its heart A desire for death.
A desire for death. Now, that's a pretty striking statement.
It is.
How does this connect to his perspective on Socrates?
Well, I think for Nietzsche, Socrates becomes the paradigmatic embodiment of this desire for systematization.
Okay.
He sees Socrates as the figure who really ushered in an era where reason was elevated above all else. And I think he felt that this led to this really dangerous oversimplification of human existence. So for you thinking about this at home, Nietzsche is suggesting that maybe that urge to have all the answers neatly packaged might actually be stifling our engagement with the richness and the complexity of life itself.
Now, what specifically about Socrates' approach did Nietzsche find so problematic?
Well, he took issue particularly with the Socratic equation of reason equals virtue equals happiness.
Okay.
He actually calls this the most bizarre equation that there is.
Oh, wow.
And he contends that it actually goes against the fundamental instincts of the older Greeks, who valued qualities like strength and beauty and noble action, things that weren't solely dependent on intellectual reasoning. So again, for you, Nietzsche is sort of challenging the very idea that being intellectually right automatically makes you a good or happy person. He's saying that our instincts and our passions play a far more significant role.
So in a way, he's saying Socrates was prioritizing intellect to the detriment of instinct.
Precisely. And he also points out that Socrates favored dialectic, this method of questioning and arguing to arrive at truth. And Nietzsche saw this as a triumph for the rabble.
The rabble?
Yes.
Okay.
A leveling of intellectual discourse where persuasive argument took precedence over an inherent noble taste. So he felt that in earlier, more aristocratic times, this kind of relentless questioning and public justification would have been considered poor form and undignified exposure. He sees it as a new kind of a nelegon, a contest or a struggle, but one of wits rather than physical prowess.
Gotcha. He goes so far as to call Socrates a clown who got people to take him seriously.
That's right.
That's quite a harsh judgment.
Yes.
What's the basis for that?
Well, I think he's suggesting that Socrates introduced this novel form of a phykigon, this intellectual contest, and became the first fencing master for the Athenian nobles, captivating them with his skills in dialectic. So he was this new and intriguing figure who could win arguments and provoke thought, even if Nietzsche believed the substance of those arguments was fundamentally flawed.
Okay, and Nietzsche doesn't stop there.
No, he doesn't.
He actually uses the term decadence in relation to Socrates.
And building on this idea of Socrates prioritizing intellect, Nietzsche goes even further and offers this rather unflattering personal assessment of the philosopher, pointing to what he sees as these indicators of Socrates' decadence, including his depraved and anarchic instincts, and overdevelopment of logic, and just this general rickety nastiness. He even mentions Socrates' auditory hallucinations, what was religiously interpreted as his daimonian or divine sign.
So he's almost portraying Socrates as someone who was internally conflicted, almost unhealthy, and then sort of elevates reason as a way to control these darker impulses.
Exactly. And Nietzsche suggests that Socrates' renowned self-mastery was actually not a sign of strength, but a response to a crisis of his era where self-control seemed to be lacking and inner instincts were kind of turning against each other. So he's saying that making rationality a tyrant, as Socrates did, suggests that we are in a perilous situation, that this is a last resort in an emergency where the Greeks had to choose between destruction or being absurdly rational.
Absurdly rational.
Yes.
Okay. So for Nietzsche, this elevation of reason at all costs wasn't a path to genuine well-being, but actually a symptom of a sickness itself. The most glaring daylight, rationality at all costs, a life clear, cold, careful, aware, without instinct, in resistance to the instincts, was itself just a sickness, another sickness, and not at all a way back to virtue, to health, to happiness. So he's saying that constantly battling your own instincts is a sign of decadence.
Yes.
Whereas in a healthy, flourishing life, happiness is in harmony with instinct.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder if Socrates himself had any awareness of this internal struggle that he was engaged in and these potential long-term consequences of his philosophical approach.
It's a question Nietzsche himself poses,
Right.
He wonders if Socrates, this cleverest of all self-outwitters, actually understood that his relentless pursuit of reason might be a form of self-deception. And he even speculates that Socrates harbored a desire for death, viewing it as the only possible cure for his condition. And that he essentially compelled Athens to provide him with that poison hemlock.
That's a pretty provocative interpretation.
It is.
He's such a foundational figure in Western thought. Okay, so let's move on. You've identified this next key area as Nietzsche's critique of reason in philosophy. It sounds like his skepticism regarding Socrates actually extends to a broader critique of how philosophers have traditionally understood and employed reason itself.
He levels this really fundamental accusation against philosophers. A lack of a sense of history. A deep-seated aversion to this very concept of becoming, which he calls Egyptianism.
Interesting.
And he argues that philosophers essentially try to elevate things by stripping them of their historical context. He wants to view things subspecie eterni as if they exist outside the flow of time and change. Effectively turning them into what he calls conceptual mummies.
Conceptual mummies, so taking something vibrant and alive and sort of freezing it into this static, abstract idea.
That's exactly right.
So he's saying that everything that philosophers have engaged with for millennia has been turned into these lifeless concepts that nothing genuinely real escapes unscathed. They venerate these abstract concepts, and in doing so, they kill and preserve whatever they idealize.
And I think that's where the fear of death, of change, of aging, of reproduction, growth comes in, because these are seen as contradictions or even refutations of their idea of what is.
Okay, so how do they attempt to access this unchanging what is?
So they're operating under the assumption that some form of illusion or deception must be preventing them from perceiving this true reality. And the culprit they identify is sensation, becoming, history, and the body itself. So the senses are viewed as these untrustworthy deceivers that mislead us about the real world. So their proposed solution is to liberate yourself from the influence of the senses, from this constant flux of becoming, from these contingencies of history, which they dismiss as merely belief in sensory experience, belief in a lie.
So the philosophical project becomes one of rejecting the tangible world in favor of some abstract ideal. And he summarizes this by saying that the philosopher's moral imperative is reject everything that lends credence to the senses, to the common people, become a philosopher, a mummy, engage in this monotonous worship of abstract being, and above all, reject the body, this pathetic idea fix of the senses, which is riddled with logical inconsistencies, but dares to act as if it were real. So Nietzsche seems to have a pretty dim view of traditional metaphysics.
He did. He makes an exception, albeit a qualified one, for Heraclitus, whom he respects for recognizing this fundamental flux of reality, this idea that everything is constantly changing. However, he feels that even Heraclitus didn't fully appreciate the validity of the senses. And Nietzsche really emphatically asserts that the senses do not lie at all. The deception, he argues, arises from our interpretations, from the imposition of these concepts like unity, thinghood, substance, and duration, all of which are products of reason.
Okay, so the senses provide us with this raw, unfiltered data, and it's our rational mind that distorts that by imposing these preconceived...
That's the crux of the argument,
categories.
He sees the senses as fine tools of observation. He gives the analogy of the nose, which can detect subtle differences that even sophisticated instruments might miss. And he contends that the progress of our scientific understanding is directly proportional to our willingness, to trust sensory evidence and refine our methods of observing and interpreting it.
What about fields like metaphysics, theology, even mathematics? Where do they fit into this?
So he rather dismissively categorizes metaphysics, theology, psychology, epistemology, logic, and mathematics as abortion and not yet science. Because in his view, reality doesn't even present itself as a problem within these frameworks. He strongly critiques this philosophical fallacy of causa sui, this notion of something being its own cause, arguing that this flawed concept inevitably leads to this idea of God as the ultimate first cause, which he calls a brain disease of sickly web spinners.
A brain disease of sickly web spinners.
Yeah.
And he also raises this issue of this error inherent in language itself.
Yeah. He believes that language, rooted in this very basic and perhaps flawed understanding of psychology, significantly contributes to these errors. It predisposes us to see actors and actions everywhere. It fosters a belief in free will and the I as this fixed entity, thereby giving rise to this concept of a thing. So for Nietzsche, this idea of a permanent being is largely an illusion created and reinforced by the structure of language itself.
Okay, so a deep skepticism towards philosophical systems built on this abstract reason that ignores the ever-changing nature of reality and that misinterprets the evidence of our senses.
Exactly.
This leads us very naturally into his perspective on morality. Which is the next topic you've identified here. Morality as anti-nature. This sounds like another deliberately provocative stance.
It is.
So how does this play out?
Well, Nietzsche posits that all healthy morality is fundamentally driven by this instinct for life. This basic affirmation of existence that seeks to fulfill life's inherent drives and needs. It's about what promotes and sustains life. And in stark contrast, he argues that almost all systems of morality that are taught and adhered to are anti-natural. Actively working against these life-affirming instincts. And he uses this well-known Christian saying, God looks into the heart, as a prime example of this.
So for you, the listener at home, Nietzsche is suggesting that many of these moral principles that we've been taught might actually be at odds with our natural inclinations as living beings. Okay, so I'm curious about that phrase, God looks into the heart. How does that exemplify this anti-natural morality?
Well, Nietzsche sees this as a rejection of both the lowest and highest desires of life. By emphasizing inner thoughts and intentions over outward actions and natural impulses, it's positioning God as kind of an enemy of life's inherent drives and portraying the saint as this ideal eunuch, someone who has suppressed their natural desires. And he sees this as this kind of sacrilegious rebellion against life itself. Ultimately, it's futile. Illusory, absurd, and dishonest.
So any moral framework that condemns the natural instincts of a living creature is by definition unhealthy.
Exactly. And he argues that any condemnation of life by someone who is themselves alive is merely symptomatic of a particular kind of life, one that's in decline, weakened, fatigued, and inherently self-condemning. He also touches on this concept of moralizing morality. I mean, he observes this pervasive temptation to seek a moral justification for morality itself, to try to find some ethical foundation for our moral beliefs. And he views this as a dangerous and ultimately self-defeating form of nihilism. So it's this infinite regress where you're trying to find a moral basis for the very thing that defines morality.
What's the alternative to this?
Well, he contrasts this with the immoralists, those who approach the world with open hearts and a spirit of affirmation, recognizing value, even in those aspects of life that morality and religious authorities often reject. So he's really championing this perspective of embracing and understanding life in its totality, rather than one of negation and condemnation.
You mentioned this really interesting example of Cornaro's very restrictive diet. How does that illustrate this point about morality being potentially anti-natural.
Luigi Cornaro famously attributed his long, healthy, and supposedly virtuous life to his extremely meager diet.
Okay.
And Nietzsche uses this to highlight how easily we can mistake correlation, causation.
Right.
Cornaro's longevity was likely due to his natural constitution, perhaps a slow metabolism, making this restrictive diet a consequence rather than the cause of his good health.
Gotcha.
So to then prescribe such a diet as a universal path to virtue and long life could be not only ineffective, but potentially harmful. Similarly, he argues that what we consider virtue might often be the effect of a naturally happy and healthy constitution rather than its cause.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So people who are naturally well-adjusted and content might act in ways that we deem virtuous.
That's right.
As a result of their inherent well-being.
Yes.
And morality has kind of got this cause and effect relationship.
That's right.
Backwards.
And he's advocating for this revaluation of all values.
Okay.
Where individuals who are naturally well-constituted instinctively act in certain ways. And their virtue is this natural outgrowth of their inherent vitality and joy in life.
Okay.
So this stands in contrast to the church and traditional morality, which often present happiness as a reward to be earned through adherence to these specific moral actions.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And how does he view things like vice and luxury in this context?
And how does he view things like vice and luxury?
He argued
that what we often label as vice and luxury are typically the effects of a society's physiological decline rather than the primary cause of its destruction.
So when a society or an individual is already weakening, they might crave these stronger stimuli. What we call vices and luxuries as a symptom of that underlying decay.
It's a manifestation of a life seeking to compensate for a lack of inherent vitality.
So morality often misdiagnoses the real problem.
That's a crucial element of his critique.
And it ends up treating these symptoms rather than addressing the root cause.
That's right.
Societal or individual decline.
He sees morality as often this reactive force condemning these outward expressions of decline rather than understanding and addressing the underlying physiological or psychological conditions.
Okay, so that sets the stage for this final section, which you've titled The Four Great Errors. And given what we've been talking about so far, I'm guessing that these errors represent these fundamental flaws in how we typically understand ourselves and the world around us. So what's the first of these great errors?
The first of these foundational errors is the error of confusing cause and effect, which we've already touched upon with Cornaro's diet. Nietzsche sees this as a really pervasive cognitive mistake, where we misinterpret correlations or temporal sequences as direct causal relationships, particularly when it comes to understanding our own well-being and our behavior. So for you thinking about this error highlights how easily we misattribute the reasons behind our successes and failures, our health and our ailments.
What's the second great error in Nietzsche's analysis?
The second is what he terms the error of false causality. And this is where we mistakenly interpret these internal facts, such as will, mind, and the I, as actual initiating causes.